Social narratives are simple stories that teach appropriate social skills or similar targeted behaviors. In addition to explicitly teaching a social skill, social narratives can be used to help learners understand the feelings and thoughts of other people. Now let's go through the steps that are involved with implementing a social narrative. In the following video, we overview the 6 steps for using instructional strategy of social narratives to support students as they practice and generalize social skills. Step number 1, identify the problem behavior in measurable terms. Step number 2, collect baseline data on the problem behavior. Step number 3, identify the new replacement behavior in measurable terms. Step number 4, create the social narrative. Step number 5, put the social narrative into action with the learner. And finally, step 6, fade out the social narrative. In this example, we will illustrate a potential social problem between 2 students. Brian loves talking to his friends. However, he doesn't know how to appropriately gain their attention to say hi or start up a conversation. Instead, he resorts to engaging in inappropriate behavior, such as tossing paper at them to gain their attention. As a result, his peers become annoyed and don't want to talk to him. Step 2 involves collecting baseline data that seeks to identify a social skill deficit. It also determines if there are certain situations that are more likely to evoke the problem behavior. This data will be useful for at least 2 reasons. First, you can determine the problem or the social skill deficit. Next, you have baseline data to determine if the social narrative is having the desired effect. A social narrative should provide a learner with relevant cues, explanations of the feelings and thoughts to be had in this particular social situation, and overall, a description of the appropriate behaviors. The narrative needs to illustrate what the learner should be doing to get their needs met. In our example, the student needs a socially appropriate way of gaining a peer's attention. They need a replacement behavior, or what we might call an appropriate and effective behavior. To ensure understanding, make sure the replacement behavior is clearly defined. For example, instead of saying Brian will appropriately gain attention from his peers, say, when in the presence of a peer in the classroom, Brian will say the peer's name and greeting without engaging in disruptive behavior. Disruptive behavior in Brian's case has been identified as either throwing items at his peers or shouting at them. Now it's time to create the social narrative. When you are writing in social narratives, you should remember the following. Use appropriate words for the learner's age and level of comprehension. Write the social narrative in first person. Include visuals. Identify the problem in the beginning of the social narrative. Mention how the learner is dealing with the problem situation by exhibiting the problem behaviors previously defined. In the social narrative, mention how the problem behavior has a negative impact on the learner and how it makes others feel. Next, introduce the new replacement behavior the learner will start to engage in. Finally, mention the positive impact the new replacement behavior has on the learner. Here's an example of a social narrative. The next step is to introduce the narrative to the student. As you can see, Ms. Rodriguez is introducing the social narrative to the student, but is not requiring him to independently demonstrate the skill yet. Once she is able to confirm the learner fully understands the content in the social narrative, Brian will be asked to try out the new skill. In order to assess Brian's understanding, you can ask questions that directly relate to the important components of the social narrative. Specifically, you can ask questions that assess the learner's understanding of the problem behavior, how the problem behavior makes others feel, what is the new replacement behavior, and what positive outcomes can come out of the new replacement behavior or social skill. When you first start implementing the social narrative, you want to pull the student aside right before the targeted social situation and review the social narrative. You don't have to read it word for word. You can just summarize it with the student. Next, you can send the student off to try and exhibit the new skill in the social narrative. Once your data shows that the student exhibiting the social skill on a consistent basis, you can start to fade out the use of the social narrative. One easy first step to fading the social narrative is to continue to pull the student aside for a few more days. But instead of reviewing the social narrative, simply use mediating statements such as, remember to say hi to your friends the same way that is in your story. After you do that for a few days and notice that it's working, you can try reminding the student a few hours before the social situation. Finally, you can assess how the learner does without the use of these fading prompts. Social narratives can be used to reduce inappropriate behaviors and foster the development of appropriate social skills. The story format also makes the learning fun, which in turn should further engage your learner. Give it a try. For additional information on Voice Advisor and the series of illustrations we've created to foster the practice and generalization of social skills into the classroom environment, visit voiceadvisor.org.